So, welcome everybody. It's exciting to be here on the global conference on transformative innovation policies. What brings us together here is a shared conviction that we need transformative innovation to come to a more sustainable economy. And in this session, we will explore in particular the role of citizens in transformative innovation policies, in particular mission-oriented innovation policies. My name is Laurens Hessels. I work with the Rathenau Institute in Den Haag in the area of science and innovation policy. And I'm also a professor by special appointment at Leiden University. I've prepared this session together with my colleague Amber Geurts. And we chose an interdisciplinary, or rather intersectoral approach for this session. The aim is to exchange experiences about citizen participation in different domains: public administration, living laboratories, and scientific research. I'm delighted that we have 4 excellent speakers here today, representing experiences with citizen participation in these 3 domains. Uta Ween, Sanna Goodby, Mark Dijk, and Margaret Gold. So they will all speak to you briefly later. But first, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Amber to introduce the topic and the program a bit further. Yeah. Amber, please go ahead.
Thank you, Laurens. I'm going to the next slide. You can see a little bit of the agenda that we prepared. We first thought that we would be doing a short introduction. Let's meet each other via Mentimeter. And then a short introduction of the topic and the panelist pictures, and then concluding with the discussion. So we would like to ask you all to go to Mentimeter and to fill in the code that is shown below, 16210692. And then we have 2 questions prepared. The first one is, considering we are talking about citizen participation, which countries do we actually represent? So from where are the citizens in our session?
Yeah. It would be really great if you participate also because we cannot see you. So we are really curious who you are. At the same time, yeah, this is better, Amber. I realized that the code is probably maybe behind our pictures, but now it's visible. 16210692.
Yeah, and I'm going quickly also to Mentimeter to see if this works. It should work.
Here it's visible as well.
Okay. So 16210692.
And unfortunately, we as a speaker cannot easily participate in the Menti, although, yeah, why not? Maybe we can in a different tab. But we learned from the organizers that the audience has their own, great. So there should be like a special interface. UK, wonderful.
Yes.
So we have some people watching. That's reassuring.
Yes, Brazil, Colombia, more from the Netherlands. Very nice. I think
yes,
this
and please feel free to use the chat as well. Yeah, it's nice that people start introducing themselves. Please do. Welcome, Helen. Welcome, Jago. Welcome, Jonas and Francesco. Good. So, Amber, maybe.
Thanks. I will do the next question because we prepared 2. One is, now we know where we're from. We would also like to know what you would like to learn about citizen participation. So why are you here today? And it's feel free to fill in what are your expectations, what would you like to learn, what do you hope to take away from this session. And also you can introduce yourself. How to do it more effectively. Yes.
Yeah, that might be like a central question, overarching.
Yeah. Is it taking place? Is it actually inclusive citizen participation? Also interesting, consistency in citizen participation. So also about when do you involve citizens, for example, in designing missions, and not only in the implementation. Yeah. These are some nice ideas. Good question. Okay, so there's also what has worked well, the process of, and some on the bottom, which I hope will be shown later. I am sharing multiple screens, so good, nice. We have some interesting questions, and I hope the presentations today can also give some feedback on that. I'm now switching back to the slides to also make sure we have time to discuss. So these were the 2 questions. So for today, we decided a small introduction of this idea of the new type. We consider the new type of innovation policies, which we refer to as challenge-driven innovation policies. And these are innovations and policies that center the missions or the societal challenges, put them center stage. And so in many cases, there's a theory of change that underlies how you can actually achieve the impact or the societal challenge that you want to address. We argue this theory of change is often, in the case of challenge-driven innovation policies, backward-driven. So you go from the impact that you want to make to what does that mean in regards to the outcomes or the outputs, what kind of activities fit there, and what does it requires for the input then. And from there on, you can consider it back. So this is how we kind of position the different types of new innovation policies that have emerged in the recent years. And when we look at the literature, we see several examples. We have these policies for grand societal challenges. We have the transformative innovation policies, maybe perhaps the more well-known, the new mission-oriented policies, most famously introduced by Mariana Mazzucato. And for today, we focus a little bit more on this mission-oriented innovations policies, which is prominent in the Netherlands, but also in the Horizon Europe. And when we look at these missions, we see an increasing emphasis on the role of citizens and citizen participation, arguing in these missions that they provide some kind of new perspective for developing actually workable, accepted, scalable, shared solutions and implementations that can tackle societal challenges. So we see increased expectations formulated in these missions with regards towards the involvement of civil society. And Horizon Europe is, and their missions that are shown here, there are 5, is one of the most prominent examples in which this emphasis on civil society is most well formulated. But when we look at citizen participation, it also raises questions. For example, the Horizon Europe missions pay a lot of attention to involving citizens, but not necessarily addressing questions whether we can involve them and what kind of capacities do we as researchers or policymakers, implementers, or even citizens need to actually be able to be capable to participate. And also questions arise, of course, of when do you then involve citizens? Is it in the design process? Is it in the implementation process? Is it afterwards in the evaluation of these missions? Before you can also ask the question, how, which methods can you use? Of course, citizen participation has been a topic that has been addressed in different fields, as Lauren so well explained at the beginning. But here we also see questions or challenges still open to be addressed. And we highlighted 3 for this session, namely 1, the diversity in participating citizens. So what type of citizens are involved in these processes, and are we inclusive and diverse enough in that sense? The second one, there's also the citizen participation in different roles. So citizens can make contributions, for example, in doing actual research, collecting data, these kind of things. But they could also play a role in setting up a mission, designing policy options that would fit most, considering their local environment. So this is a second question that we have considered. And finally, also the follow-up from citizen participation. So once you have given a voice to citizens, what do you do with what comes out of this citizen participation? So not just citizen participation for its symbolic value, but for reaching actual implementations and implications. And these 3 challenges we pose as the operational challenges for citizen participation in mission-oriented research. And we argue that in spite of the general support of the idea of involving citizens, we might not necessarily know enough about how to do this effectively, as one raised also in the Mentimeter, inclusively, also raised, and responsibly. So this is why we brought together the 4 speakers that will follow my presentation, Uta, Sanna, Mark, and Margaret, to share their visions and experiences on this topic. And we will start with Uta. And now I have to quickly.
Thank you, Amber, for this introduction. Yes. And let me also encourage the audience, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat, because unfortunately we cannot see your faces. So it's nice to have some confirmation that you're still there. Please do feel free to react. I would now like to announce the next speaker, Uta. Uta Veen is Associate Professor of Water Innovation Studies at IHE Delft, the Netherlands. She is working on several citizen science projects across the world and using Living Labs principles and tailoring user-centered and multi-stakeholder co-design methods to citizen science. So Uta, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Narens, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here and to discuss this really exciting topic with you. Indeed, a lot of my work focuses on how we can engage citizens and communities in addressing complex local challenges or even wicked problems related, typically my work related to water and environment, often at local and regional scale. I have included a whole collage of logos of projects where we've done this work. Don't worry, I won't be talking you through all of them, but it's an action research approach that we've rolled out in Europe, Africa, in the Middle East. And essentially what I'd like to touch upon just very briefly is the question of who to engage, how to engage them, and for what. So not why, but for what. And arguably all 3 aspects, of course, are closely interrelated. Next, please. So on the question of who we engage and whether that's diverse enough and indeed inclusive, yes, we're trying to follow good principles in the field of citizen science, community-based monitoring that we do this work in. And of course, it takes a lot of effort, but it typically starts with a sound stakeholder analysis. So it's not ad hoc and haphazard, but we start with a stakeholder analysis per case to know which existing community structures can we tap into. Typically in the Netherlands, those would be cycling associations, and in other countries we have community resource boards managing local resources, etc. So we don't start from zero there, but we start in a strategic way. And it takes a lot of effort to drill down to the different groups, but usually there is a large element of success. Next, please. Then the question of who to engage for us is not just one of which citizens, individual or communities to engage, but actually in parallel also which scientific expertise do we need to address this societal challenge, and which policy decision makers, and usually there's a whole collage of them that come into play. And in this conference, people will say, hang on, we're working with a quadruple helix. Where's the fourth bubble? Well, it's there, except that the scientific expertise for us often also incorporates commercial data aggregators, technology developers, etc. So we really bring an approach in terms of the quadruple helix to bear when we work with citizens and communities. Next, please. How we do this? Well, we've tried to work out a thorough and sound co-design methodology that indeed works in the living labs context in different countries, bringing these real life problems to bear. In the discussion, we have carefully structured a methodology that works on a series of interaction moments. And the important thing here is that we haven't defined the ultimate impact. This is what these stakeholders do together. And we're merely there to facilitate a conversation. And we're also there to allow people to be part of this process as much as they want. And what we have seen in different co-design groups across different countries, that often in the co-design process of what is the challenge we're addressing, how we're going to do this, we often see that older parts of the population, senior citizens, are able to free up their time for this, whereas when we actually roll out activities, do data collection, that's when younger parts of the population are keener to be involved. So we see clear differences in preferences. Of course, it's difficult to generalize too drastically, but not everybody wants to co-design, and also not everybody wants to collect data. But sound co-design ensures that we start with issues that are really of relevance and interest of these stakeholders. And that, of course, is a good recipe for ensuring their continued engagement in these activities. Next, please. And we've rolled out this approach in the Ground Truth 2.0 project, for example, in Europe and Africa. And we've helped set up what we call different citizen observatories. These are a specific form of citizen science initiatives that already have a very close link to relevant policy areas. They also come with a sound IT, information communication technology infrastructure. But we see here that using a consistent approach in very different socioeconomic, political, geographical settings, these communities have chosen to focus on very different thematic challenges because that's what they're facing in their local environment. And we've helped them to build up citizen observatories that really help them to address these challenges over time. Next, please. But that's all well and good, you might say, but what for what? So this is not the predefined impact in terms of the thematic challenge. Next, please. But rather, I would argue it's what is the new reality that they want to move to? What are the institutional changes? How are they going to take decisions jointly or not in the future? And what role are citizens and communities willing to play in that? And that's not the same for all these different countries that we've worked in. We see clearly that in some cases, communities are very happy to be more involved in what we might call environmental monitoring, either explicitly or implicitly contributing data. In others, they want a more cooperative planning paradigm where there is clear consultation going beyond data collection. And in yet other contexts, we see that they really want true environmental stewardship, where we have fully realized dialogues across stakeholders, institutional, scientific, civil society, in sharing responsibilities for natural resource management. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And the co-design process is there to help them identify what kind of future interactions and governance structures are they intending to move towards. And of course, that will not be a fixed point in time, but that can evolve further. Next, please. So, and another click. And then if we then look back at what happened in Ground Truth, we had 7 case studies in 6 countries. And by carefully helping them through the co-design process, they could sort of take their pick, place their emphasis of where they wanted to be in this schematic in terms of stakeholder interactions. And we can see the diversity. So the same method, and yet it allows different communities and different constellations of multiple stakeholders to make joint choices of how they want to take decisions. Next, please. So just to wrap up, there are a whole range of resources already available that you can explore. A video on the ground truth approach, but also the We Observe cookbook that gives a lot of rich information on all kinds of aspects of stakeholder engagement. But the important point I'd like to finish on is the ethical responsibility that we as social scientists, as action researchers have. When we engage stakeholders from whichever walk of life, we raise expectations and we have responsibilities to deliver of them, because particularly for poor communities, marginalized communities, there are huge opportunity costs involved in being part of our stakeholder engagement. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Uta, for your wonderful pitch. This is really relevant material. We will continue immediately. So if you have questions in the audience, please enter them in the chat or remember, and we will come back later. First, we would like to introduce the other talks as well. So our next speaker in line is Sanna Godby. She's the co-owner of the DigiDem Lab in Sweden. That DigiDem Lab is a non-profit lab that develops platforms, tools, and methods to increase participatory democracy. Sanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just go ahead and start my presentation here. It's really nice to be here with you, although I can't see you, the audience, but I feel your presence. So I'm going to just shortly talk a bit about our work. So I, like mentioned before, I work at DigiDem Lab, a democracy lab. We're based in Sweden, but we also work internationally with lots of municipalities in different places, including the European Union with their recent project. And I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the examples from the cities that we've been working in. And before I tell you about that, I'm just going to show you quickly what we mean when we say citizen participation. So this is a framework that we often use when we plan different types of participation processes. And the thing I want you to pay attention to is that usually when we talk about decision making, it's so much focused on the actual decision itself. Like, for example, doing a referendum where citizens get to vote yes or no. But what we really think is important to highlight is that decision making is not only the act of the decision itself, it's also everything that happens before and after. For example, raising awareness about issues in your local community and getting the attention of decision makers to actually create a process around it. Like, does it come from below? Does it come from the government itself? What's the discussion around the subject itself? What type of ideas are generated? And then that's when the solutions come, and that's when the decision is taken. And after a decision is taken, a lot of steps are, like as Amber mentioned before, a lot of things are happening after in terms of decisions being implemented. And one of the most important things when talking about citizen participation, especially among groups with less power, is that they have a history of mistrust, and it's actually based on being not listened to and feeling that their voice doesn't matter. So that's the most important thing to remember, is that it has to be actual decision making. It has to be real decisions, and that's what we take account to when we choose which processes that we work with. That we want it to be about real things that matter to the people and to the community, and that citizens should always be part of the process from the beginning to the end. And just an example of why this is important is an investigation that was done in Sweden. And I think this highlights a problem that's common in the entire world, not just in Sweden. But the investigation showed that only a couple of percent, 2% of the population is actively involved in political parties today in Sweden. And of those that are involved are political leaders in their communities. Few actually represent the population. Very few are young, very few are women, very few are people of color. And that's a real democratic problem. And I think, like I said, this is common everywhere. And what we need to realize about democracy is that we must make it more accessible, and it has to be closer to people. It has to be about things that matter to them. And it's really important that it's an everyday democracy. And that's what we're trying to work with. And just like 3 concrete examples. The first one is a project that we've been working on for the last 2 years since the pandemic started. We've been working with the city of New York And as you all know, New York was one of the cities that were particularly hardly hit by the pandemic. Especially young people had a lot of issues when it came to health, mental health. So what we did is that we helped them launch participatory budgets with young people during the pandemic, where young people got to decide how to spend $100,000. And what we did was that we did a community polling among young people about the issues that matter to them most, and all young people were welcome to participate in New York. And then youth organizations based their proposals on the polling that we did with young people and the ideas and the needs that young people had. They created well-developed proposals, and then all of the young people got to vote on which proposals that they needed for their community. And what's interesting about the method that we used is that we worked with at a youth fellowship where we trained young people and paid them and to do a fellowship with the government. So they learned a lot about how the government works, and they were actually coalition builders that built collaborations with their local community and became youth leaders. And now they're doing lots of other things in local government. And that's just one example of what we've been doing. We're doing a lot of different projects connected to participatory budgeting, but also to other projects as well in the US. Another example is in Sweden, where we've been working with housing companies and schools together with the municipality. So during the pandemic, we noticed that a lot of people actually are staying in, obviously, in their houses. So we started to work more and more with housing companies to reach tenants. So the housing companies would set aside large parts of their budgets, and tenants living in the area got to decide what to do with the money, how they wanted to improve their surroundings, their buildings, doing activities, events, and other things that impacts their living situation. And then we also engaged the local schools. So we did lectures with teachers and young people at school. And we created collaborations between the schools and the housing companies. And they became important meeting places for the local community during the pandemic. And the last example I'm going to talk about is a research project that we've been doing called Code Digits, Collective Intelligence through Digital Tools. And it's a 3-year-long research project that we have together with the University of Helsinki, the municipality of Helsinki, Nesta, an institution in the UK, and an institution in Norway and in Sweden, and then us, Digidem Lab. And we're looking at hundreds of examples of citizen participation, and we're trying to create a framework for evaluating participation processes through barriers and enablers, and then testing them in different pilots in 3 different cities in the Nordics. And at the end, we're going to come up with a framework for how you can improve participation. And when you use digital participation, how can you do it in a more inclusive way to actually engage people, and especially people with less power? So in the example of Finland, we've been looking at the Russian-speaking minority. In an example of Sweden, we've been looking at the Somali minority, for example, in Sweden. So looking at language barriers as well, and using technology. So those are just a couple of examples of what we're doing. It's a short on time here, but I'm happy to answer more questions later about our work. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sanna. Thank you. It's nice how you connect to the diversity challenge that Amber introduced. Next speaker is Mark Dijk. Mark is a research fellow at the Sustainability Institute at Maastricht University here in the Netherlands. He is leading the Smarter Labs project, an action research project that's integrating lessons and experiences from smart city living labs in several cities: Maastricht, Brussels, Graz, and Bellinzona, if I pronounce correctly. Mark, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lams, for the word, and thanks a lot for being part of this great session, which has a lot of overlap with my work. I already heard very interesting things in the others. So we use the term urban labs, and I'll share some experience from that. So broadly speaking, maybe everybody knows, but for urban labs, we use the definition of basically 3 key elements that labs are multi-actor projects. So not just a firm developing something, but it's always with different types of actors. It's also focused on learning. So there are particular things you want to learn for doing a lab experiment. And also the urban labs always have a real place basis. So it's either on a street or it's a particular neighborhood. Sometimes it's a whole city, but it's related to a particular place. So action research, we are actually organizing lab experiments and then try to understand how labs can work effectively, how results can be scaled up further, and also how labs can be inclusive. So I'm talking especially about the Smarter Labs project today, as Laurens mentioned. Actually, it's finished now. We will soon start Better Labs, which is a follow-up project which tries to understand how labs can be effectively embedded in local structures in order to use the lessons most effectively. And in parallel, we are also involved in SummaLab, which is a meta lab, which is a sort of lab connecting different cities in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Delft, where they try to learn from each other's experiments. But that's a challenge in itself, which I will not speak about today. Next slide, please, where I will share some findings from Smarter Labs, which indeed did various urban lab experiments in 4 different cities across Europe. Well, I thought maybe to make our theories on participation a bit more sort of relative, or in the sense that maybe remarkable enough or maybe not for some. Of course, participation is talked about everywhere, but it's still, in our experience in the cities that we worked with, there are clearly also still actors who try to sort of decrease the level of participation. With urban policymakers, it was clear that they find participation adding much complexity to their policy development process. So they're clearly sort of trying to keep it to a manageable level, or to a minimum level maybe. And also from the representatives of businesses, at least in our urban labs, we found that they are sort of very much strategically trying to connect to the municipality, and they sort of try to decrease the invitations to citizens. And they said, well, they don't know about mobility problems, because Smarter Labs was especially about mobility and transport. They said, well, we have a lot of experience about how this works, and well, all these citizens, they just dream about sustainability, but it doesn't work anyway. So it's well, it learned us that as researcher and organizer of labs, you need to proactively actually argue for the usefulness and explain why participation makes sense and makes the lessons much more valid, and makes the impact of your experiments larger, and so to go against the trends, so to speak, or the pressure. Next slide, please. So another a few findings from it. Well, as I mentioned, Smarter Labs was about urban mobility problems and solutions, how those could be created and also assessed together. So regarding some lessons about how to involve stakeholders. Like Uta said in her case, we also did a stakeholder analysis, so very much connected to the particular problem at hand, and trying to analyze also together with stakeholders which are particular relevant types here to invite, where you have to go beyond general labels, or you have to get as specific as possible, to put it that way. So we had travelers at first, but then we found out that actually travelers who live in the center are different travelers from those who live at the outskirts, are different travelers that actually commute from out of the city to the city. So we had 3 types of travelers, in addition to businesses and policymakers and a few others. So that's one thing. In terms of sort of barriers to involve stakeholders, we found out there's a difference between unwilling stakeholders unwilling to join, and stakeholders unable to join. And that you basically, after you from your stakeholder analysis, found out that you would really like to have particular stakeholders in the room, that you have to think whether they may be willing enough, whether they are able to join. And in terms of unwillingness, we found out that sometimes you have to reframe the topic of your lab a bit in order to make it attractive enough for stakeholders to come. For instance, in Brussels, they found out that actually people were not really interested in mobility and transport, but they were in health, especially health for their children. And that's why they framed it as an air quality lab, which helped to have, especially at primary schools, to attract a lot of attention and involve mothers and fathers first, and from that onwards they broadened it. So that's a way to deal with that. And in terms of unable to join, you really have to think. I think Jutta also already mentioned that what type of activities you do. So it can be in terms of the time at which you do activities. Some people are not available during the day or not available during the evening. In terms of technology, if you have smartphones or other digital tools, sometimes you have to give people a smartphone because they don't have one. So you have to anticipate that in the organization of your lab. Sanne already mentioned the language issue. In many places you have to think about different languages that people speak. Well, you also have to think about, is it, for instance, a sort of debate? Then some people are not comfortable with speaking in big groups. So you would have to find a way maybe to have first smaller groups and then have a representative smaller group talking on behalf of that. So very practical. Next and final slide, please. So so we also invited people in 2 subsequent sessions. We also found out that it was really hard to have the same people coming twice. So people are very much looking like, why would I join? What do I get for my time? And so that's really that was a difficult one for us that we didn't really solve, that you have people losing throughout the process. But let me stop here. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. Wonderful, and nice that you also add very practical lessons, because in the end that's also crucial to make it work. Let me announce our final pitch. Margaret Gold, she's coordinator of the Citizen Science Lab of Leiden University here in the Netherlands, and in this role she works with citizen science projects in a wide range of disciplines. And Margaret, please go ahead.
I started sharing before I unmuted myself, so hereby unmuting first and starting to share again. A shame that we can't be together in person, but technology is fantastic that it brings us together across these distances and different lockdown situations. And so I work at the Citizen Science Lab at Leiden University, but it's very much about being out in the world, starting with our own city of Leiden, but also in the region around us, and working in collaboration with societal partners. Within the university, the Citizen Science Lab is connected with all of the 7 faculties of science, so colleague researchers in a really wide range of domains. And Citizen Science Lab sits in the middle of this, on the one hand, as a project incubator, collaborations and project coordinations, and the other hand as a knowledge hub for both doing citizen science and researching citizen science, bringing it into the educational context in the university and with other societal partners. And I'd like to tell you about a unique case that we had on the occasion of the university celebrating 444 years since its founding. This was a year-long plan of events from the university towards the city that we're in and the whole surrounding region to engage with the city and the residents. And what we really wanted to do was to address engaging, really the first challenge, engaging the citizens and the residents of the city across a wide spectrum of demographics and corners of daily life in the science that the university does, but also in science in general. And we wanted to do that in co-creation throughout. So we really approached this as a radical co-creation process to come up with a citizen science project that we could do with the entire city. And we looked at different types of co-creation for how we would engage and how we would facilitate this and how we would approach it, building on the same kinds of processes that Uta described as well, that she's been doing in her work with citizen observatories. And this is what our step plan largely looked like over the course of 1 year. We started with a citywide call for research questions. And we had a process to narrow these down into ones that are suitable for citizen science, that we could answer an interesting question together using citizen science approaches. Also, most importantly, that we could connect it with stakeholders in the city, policymakers and decision makers who could do something with this information, that any data collected could inform them on decisions or actions that they might take. And then a development process that would come to the launch of the public project. So this very messy, very creative project looked a little bit like this. We started with the call for ideas. Well, the diversity challenge, how do you reach out widely across a city? And for us, it was about going to all of the places where people gather, particularly where they already have some kind of interest, either in the city, in science, in various issues that we're experiencing in our daily lives. So we went to museum open days, we went to science cafes, we went to neighborhood meetings, we went to neighborhood houses, and we introduced people to existing citizen science projects, and we talked about some of the known things in the city that people might have questions about, and we collected these questions. Oops, that slide's not showing.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can give that a refresh. I've noticed that each of them don't necessarily load.
So, Margaret, you were still...
Are you able to see my screen still?
No, not
You've
at
lost
the
my
moment.
screen. Let me go back to my screen.
So you were sort of halfway.
And it went black. Have we got it again now?
Yeah, thanks.
So this is now showing the co-creation stage of the process, where we were co-creating from the ideas that were narrowed down into a short list. People were the most curious about what plastic pollution was like in our city, what plastic pollution was getting into the canals and the waterways, and whether being a city that's so close to the coastline, whether these plastics were entering the coasts. And we brought those main questions together now in co-creation sessions. How do we want to research this? How do we want to find out what's happening in the city? And this led to the development of the Plastic Spotter project. So at the end of the initial co-creation, we then launched the Plastic Spotter project. And this was done using a mobile phone application called Crowdwater that allowed you to also log how much plastic pollution you were seeing in a particular space, and what the density of the pollution was, and also whether you took it out or not. And this brought us to what we experienced with challenge number 2, which was varying levels of participation in the project. Crowdwater is an excellent, beautifully designed app, and it allowed people to report where they were seeing plastic pollution. But in terms of the experience of who all is using the Crowdwater app, it's very widely spread, which on the one hand is a strength, but it tells less strongly the story about what was happening in the city of Leiden. And we got so much fantastic press that more and more people were starting to engage with the app. But what was coming out of that very first experience of using the Crowdwater app to report plastic spotted in the waterways is people were also telling us that they were frustrated that they couldn't just take it out. What they wanted to be was active in addressing the plastic pollution problem. So the motivation to take part in the Citizen Science Project was the activist instinct to also want to tackle the problem. The very first people that got involved in a much more active way said, let's get into the water and take this out and see what we've got. So then we had the mapping of the plastics matched together with an activist approach to what are we finding and sorting this and taking action based on that. And the very first research outcomes that came out of this were showing us where plastic was coming into the canals. You could just make out a map of the canals in the top right corner of this science poster. And this was right when the COVID pandemic started launching and we were locking down. And one of the biggest hotspots for plastic in the canalways was right outside of McDonald's, where people couldn't eat inside anymore. They were sitting on the canal eating, and their garbage was blowing into the water. So the very first action that we took was coming with this evidence back to the McDonald's and saying, we need some more bins. And they put that in place right away. And we've got some interesting science that came out of it. But the biggest engagement that came out of it was a change in how the project worked. So this is where the participation changed and also the follow-up citizen engagement changed. The nature of the Plastic Spotter project moved away from the mobile app and started becoming a volunteer canoeing project where there's a regular group of people that every single weekend are on the canals of Leiden taking out plastic and continuing to monitor the garbage that they're finding, not just plastic. And reporting on this, but also visiting groups. So it's a social activity that you can do with friends. You can book a trip and get actively involved in it. And there's different people that are reporting their finds every single weekend. You hear signs and balloons and inflatables and all sorts. But this is getting translated into action for policy change. So one of the items that gets found frequently in Leiden is terrace menus. All of the waterside cafes and restaurants that have a menu. So many of these are blowing into the water. And what's interesting about these objects found in the water is you can say where you found them, but you also know where it started because you know what restaurant it came from. And interestingly, we were seeing something about the three-dimensional effects of water and four-dimensional too, actually, over time. Because some of these menus could be dated back to many years ago. It was an old menu, old prices, old items. So we could also track how long it had been in the water and maybe say something about the actions that brought it back up to the surface again. So the active participants in Plastic Spotter presented this report to the policymaker in the city that's responsible for what we call horeca, hotels and restaurants and cafes. And with this report, there's now a partnership with all of the cafes and restaurants in Leiden to have a completely plastic-free terrace. So all of the little objects that can fall into water or blow away or become part of our pollution problem, little sugar packages, little salt packages, all of those things, there's a project to tackle these together. The next development of the follow-on and also the changing participation is to now embed this initiative in the city. So we have a physical location called the Grachtwacht, the Canal Watch, which is an old bridge watch, an old building on the bridge for the raising and the lowering of the bridge, which has been taken over as an outreach location, a small museum of objects found, has become a permanent base for the initiative, as the base for the canoe activists taking plastic out, and it's expanding its range of research. So it's now also looking very timely at the instances of COVID-19 litter in the waterways. Not only that, but its impact on animal life. So very specific new research trajectory coming out of this, once again, with an activist bent to address the specifically COVID-19 litter and how that's impacting animals and wildlife around us, which is the end of my presentation. So I will.
Thank you, Margaret, for this wonderful presentation. I mean, I appreciate the way you have connected your talk to the three challenges we formulated. But also, I enjoyed like the visual quality of your slides, which made me think like maybe aesthetics can also be one way to increase participation and increase commitment to citizen participation. I realize that time is short, and I have not been a very good chair today, so there's only 10 minutes left. What I would like to do, I would like to invite all the speakers on the virtual stage now to have a discussion about the three challenges that Amber has introduced. And we have already received a couple of interesting questions in the chat. I would like to involve them, connect them also to these challenges. So to pick them up in connection to the challenges. So maybe we can start with the topic of diversity. One of the questions in the chat is about rewards for and benefits for engagement. By Klaus Seibt, do the citizen participants get any grants or benefits? Is there any of our speakers today who has experience with giving rewards to citizens and how this can help to increase diversity?
Yeah, sure, I can say something.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the type of participation processes that we work with is citizen assemblies that probably a lot of you have heard about, where you randomly select citizens so that you have a demographic representation of the public, and then they create recommendations about important policies. And there's been a lot of examples of citizen assemblies tied to the climate issue. And it's always one of the topics whether you should give the participants a grant or not, and how much they should be given. One thing that is important is that there's a difference of reducing hinders for someone's participation and giving people a salary. So by reducing hinders, I mean being able to provide child support or transportation, living arrangements, maybe even compensating for people missing their work. That's so that they're on the same scale of people that usually always participate. So that's something that we find as a good investment. And then we also have, I mean, at my work, we also have an experience of having smaller grants given to young people, so that you train young people, and it's almost like a salary, but like on a minor base. And they work on an hourly rate, and then they engage their local communities. And I think that's equally important, because we can't expect young people to participate like volunteers if we want them to actually be taken seriously. So I think it's a good thing to do, and a way to, yeah, like I said, to make participation equal.
Thank you. Are there any other reactions from the speakers on the topic of diversity after hearing the others talk? Any lessons that we can draw about increasing diversity in participants? No immediate reactions. Okay, so then let's move to the second challenge. We talked about different citizen participation in different roles. And maybe I think Uta and Margaret showed the move in citizen science that we're currently in, like from more the data collection role to the wider diversity of roles. Are there any lessons? Yeah, you would like to elaborate?
That's something I neglected to mention with the academic publications that are coming out of this work, is that active participants are named in the list of co-authors in these research publications, and it's yet another role of continuing to be an active participant throughout the entire journey.
Yeah, is this already becoming common, or is this more like in the experimental phase?
It's increasingly common, and it's one of the key principles within the 10 principles of citizen science that have been developed by the community of practitioners across Europe, that where possible, participants should be cited and given recognition for their involvement.
Yeah.
But Lawrence, if I may come in here, I think connected to this question of, who's doing what, and of course also why they're doing it. I think what we've seen from the examples, both from our own work, but also from Margaret and Mark, is that people don't just want to contribute to science, they want to take action. And it actually, in an interesting way, provides an opportunity to bypass policy. People are no longer requiring on policy to set the frame and, to stimulate which way actors should direct and behave. People take very local, direct action, and that's I think to some extent the beauty of these approaches, because working in a demand-driven, challenge-driven way, and Mark said this very clearly, the topic that they proposed was not familiar, it was not popular. We've seen similar things happening, and that really forces us as facilitators of these processes to say, who are we to say? The communities, drive. If you allow the communities to drive this, you can guide it towards really direct action on the ground to improve the actual situation.
Yeah, so this raises maybe more questions about the roles of us as researchers collaborating with them than about their own roles, right? So would you say they kind of mobilize science to bypass policy, or am I then making it too simple?
No, that's perhaps putting it too harshly, but it's also no longer this paradigm of saying, hey, let's arm some citizens and then they can make their case to policymakers. That's also not the case. I mean, if we work in a more diverse multi-stakeholder setting from the start, we overcome these silos to begin with, even when we frame the challenge, when we frame the problem, why are we here? And that raises the very practical aspects also. Mark touched upon this. We've seen this in our work. Who you want to engage, well, they're not available 9 to 5 when you want to work with volunteers, because that's when they have their daytime job. So often we've found that we have to split some of our co-design processes, work in parallel before we could bring it together and find a compromise, perhaps, in the late 9 to 5 and early evening hours, when people were really so involved in the issue that they wanted to talk to the other parties that we were talking to in other time slots. So it really requires that flexibility on behalf of all stakeholders.
Yeah. Let's take a couple of other questions before our time is up. The 2 other questions I saw connect with the follow-up. Helen Palter, she asked, how do we get government to listen to the results of stakeholder engagement for missions such as decarbonization when incumbents may not favor change? And Alessandra Boni asked, how do you approach the evaluation of these initiatives in a participatory way? Who can I ask to respond to one of these questions? Mark? Yeah.
I would say, of course, it depends on the way that the project has started. Sort of the context of the project often sort of defines already whether it is a sort of set up by the local government or whether it's totally bottom up. So of course it's difficult to answer this question of how to get governments to listen. How to sort of answer that in a general way. In principle, it's also sort of the general dilemma or contradiction between knowledge or scientific results and sort of the political messiness of whether there's actual political reasons to implement it. Well, in our new project and Better Labs, we're going to test better sort of learning process connections between the lab and the policy makers. So that's, I think, something that research also still can explore and try to get clear whether there are particular, well, for instance, particular monitoring panels of experiments that are occupied by policymakers. That such sort of structures can help actually to get lessons used and by policymakers.
Thanks. Actually, I'm not sure what will happen in 1 minute. The session is over. I don't know if we have any extra time. But is there any final anyone who would like to have a final word before we close?
I just wanted to come back to Alejandra's question on the evaluation in a participatory way. We do this through a co-design approach. We involve the communities in first of all setting the priorities, but also identifying how we can measure progress towards those objectives and impacts. So we do it full circle.
Good. Yeah. Amber, maybe can you share any impressions of, because you introduced us to the topic and now we've listened to the 4 speakers.
Yeah.
What's
Well, I noticed today we have really some interesting insights on actually also the practical side of doing citizen science, citizen participation, I mean. And I found it very interesting to see that in many cases the stakeholder analysis is very important, which might indeed not only include who is participating, but what are they interested in. And place, the local environment, seems to be also a very central element to doing citizen participation well or effectively. I think one of the challenges that is, I think, known among all these initiatives is this idea of diversity, making sure that it is more diverse than those that are most common to participate. But I found it very interesting to also see the idea that not every citizen wants to participate in the same way in the same project. So in that sense, diversity there should also be an interesting element to add to the design of a citizen participation project. And what I noticed in all examples was the remaining challenge, which we didn't necessarily identify beforehand, but of continuity. So continued citizen engagement in the different projects seems to be a challenge that also, maybe it is something one time off, maybe that's okay, maybe it isn't and it shouldn't, but then how can you ensure continuity on that sense? That seems to be a question that still lingers in some of these projects. So that should be an interesting avenue also to dive deeper into. And I think in light of the missions, that of course, this session was set up from this idea of the mission-oriented innovation policies. And I think some of the experiences from today has shown that setting a mission, setting a goal, and arguing this is important might not necessarily be what citizens consider most important. But if you reformulate and reframe it, it might enter into the sphere of interest of citizens. And it might, in that sense, not necessarily mean a reformulating of an entire mission, but making it more towards what a citizen might be interested in. So it's not about mobility, but it's about air quality. But that's a consequence of mobility. So therefore, it's part of the challenge of addressing mobility and changing mobility in the city. So it's kind of defining also your mission in a sphere of what is related to the challenge that is at hand and how does that speak to the citizens?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting finding for today.
Yeah. Thank you. It's time to wrap up now. Personally, I think time was running too fast today. But I do think personally that our setup was nice in the way of comparing the perspectives and experiences from different settings with citizen participation. I've learned a lot from it, and at the Rathen Institute, we will definitely build on this session in a new project that we are currently designing. I would like to thank all the speakers for their great presentations. And I would also like to thank the audience for being here with us and interacting in the ways that were possible. So hope to see you soon in another occasion, and have a nice evening or have a nice afternoon for the ones in a different time zone. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of this conference.